Good morning, students. Good morning to all. And last day we have studied about the types of balance of payment disequilibrium, the meaning of balance of payment disequilibrium, and the types of balance of payment disequilibrium. So today also just we will remind what we have studied on last day, and we will go to the new concepts. So last day we studied the types of balance of payment disequilibrium. So normally the three types of balance of payment disequilibriums are prevailing in our nations. First one is cyclical disequilibrium, next one secular disequilibrium, then structural disequilibrium. The cyclical disequilibrium arises because of two reasons. First, two countries may be passing through different bases of business cycles. So already we have studied in our basis of trade cycle. So all the nations will be facing or focusing the different type of the basis of trade cycles. Suppose if any of the nations are being in the boom situations and the another one of the trade countries are being in the depression basis, so the import and the export will be differ. The countries which is being on the depressions basis, it will import more. So the countries which is being on the boom basis, it will be exporting more to the importing countries. So the balance of payment will be in these disequilibriums on the basis of cyclical disequilibrium. So second reason is the elasticities of demand may be differ between the countries. So already we have studied on the basis of the demand only the export and the import will be arises. Suppose if any of the countries are having the more demand on any of the commodities, these countries will be in the situation of more importing. These countries will be importing the demanded commodities from the surplus commodities. Some of the other nations will not having the more demand. These demand countries will never import. But if these nations has the power to producing on that commodities more, it will be export. So because of that, the demand also, the balance of payment disequilibrium will be arises. Next, secular disequilibrium. The secular or the long run disequilibrium. The long run disequilibrium in balance of payment arises because of long run and deep seated changes in an economy as it advances from one stage of growth to another growth. So all the nations, the developing countries, not all the nations, some of the developing nations or the developing countries will be in the situation of moving from one base or the one stage to another growth stage. So it will have more investment, domestic investment. So in this initial stage of development, the domestic investment exceeds the domestic savings. So without having the savings, these developing nations will have been in the more need of making the investment. So and imports also exceed the exports. Because when the nations are going to one stage to another one of the nation, another one of the stage, it will be being in more need of making the investment but without savings. So in this situation is being like that, it have to be borrowing the money from the financial institutions. So because of that, these nations will not be able to producing the more commodities within the initial stage. So these nations must be importing that commodity from any of the other nations. But till it happens in India from the 1951 itself. Next, the structural disequilibrium. The structural changes in the economy may also will be the reasons of balance of payment disequilibrium. The structural changes include the development of alternative sources of supply. The development of alternative sources of supply also will be changes. The development of better substitute. The exhaustion of productive resources or the changes in transport routes and cost. Some of the nations will be taking the more effort to increasing their structural analysis. So when they are increasing their structural, so these nations will have to be more need of making the expenditures. So because of that, the transport routes and the cost also will be the changes, and many changes are arises. So because of that also, some of the balance of payment disequilibrium will be arise. Then today we will study about the causes for balance of payment disequilibrium. In what reasons and whichever reasons are bringing the balance of payment disequilibrium is. First one is cyclical fluctuations. The cyclical disequilibrium in different countries is caused by their cyclical fluctuations, their basis and magnitude. So we have studied every nation has to be facing in the different basis of the trade cycles. So on the basis of the trade cycles, all the nations must be in the negative balance of payment disequilibrium. Sometimes one nations will be the depression basis and another nations will be in the boom situations. But within the course of time, it will be become as controversy. So the both nations or all the nations involved in this international trade must be getting the disequilibrium, the balance of payment disequilibrium. The world trade shrinks during depression while trade flourishes during prosperity. So whenever one nations are being in the prosperity basis, these nations can have the more possibilities to export and the vice versa. Next, the structural changes. The structural disequilibrium caused by the structural changes brought by huge development and investment programs in the developing economies. So the developing countries, all the developing countries want to absorb the more foreign direct investment. If they want to get more foreign direct investment, that nations must be having the efficient structural changes. So when they are going to take the effort to changing the structural organizations, they have to make more expenditures. So when they have being in the need of making the more expenditure to the domestic nations, it cannot be able to making more exports. So such economies may have the high propensity to import for want of capital for rapid industrializations, while export may not be boosted up to that extent. So when the nations are making the more investment, it must be in the need of borrowing the money from the financial organization, the world financial organizations. And not only that, in this beginning stage, when they are making the investment, suddenly they cannot increase in the export. So mostly all the developing nations will be getting the balance of payment disequilibrium and the reason on the basis of or on the reason of structural changes. Next, development expenditures. The development disequilibrium is caused by rapid economic development, which results in income and price effect. So normally the development expenditures made by the government will not get the income and price. The less developed countries in the early stage of development are not self-sufficient. So because of that, these nations must be in the situation of import any of the commodity from other nations. So income, savings and investment are abysmally low. So when the nations are going to develop from underdeveloping, their income and savings and their invest may be very, very low. When the savings and investment is very low, these nations cannot be increased more commodity and it cannot be able to export the commodity to the another nations. So these nations must be depending upon the other nations. So they depend upon the developed countries for import of commodities, capital and technology. The export potential is low and import intensity is high. So the lower divisions countries suffer from adverse balance of payment. Next, the consumerism. The balance of payment position of a country is adversely affected by a huge increase in consumption. So even in our nations are considered as underdeveloped or the developing nations, the peoples or all the peoples in our nations having the more consuming behaviorness. Even if the peoples are not having the sufficient level of the savings, sufficient level of the income, their consumption level may be very high. So when they are consuming more commodity abundantly, the domestic demand will be created. When the domestic demand is increased as higher, the nations will be in the need of importing the commodities, demanded commodities from another nations. So this increase the need for imports and decrease the capacity to export. If the countries are going to import any of the demanded commodity from other nations, they cannot be able to increase their productions and increase their export. So the nations must be import any of the commodities from the another nations for fulfill the domestic market. Next, demonstration effect. The demonstration effect is the deficit in the balance of payment of developing countries is also caused by the demonstration effect. So this will raise the propensity to import, causing adverse balance of payments. So first we have to understand the demonstration effect. Demonstration effect means, so some of the peoples living in abroad or the developed countries, it is absorbed by the developing countries, or the peoples living in the developing countries wants to living like a peoples like a developed countries. So even in these underdeveloped countries, the peoples of underdeveloped countries are not having the savings. They can expenditure on consuming any of the more luxury commodities, and they are getting the wants and decide to living like a foreign peoples. So when they are getting the decide to living like a foreign peoples, they want to consuming more commodities. This is called the demonstration effect. So this demonstration effect also will bringing more demand in this domestic market. Next, borrowing. So international borrowing and investment may cause a deficit in the balance of payments. When the international borrowing is heavy, a country's balance of payment will be adverse since it repays the loans with interest. So when we have the possibles and chances to borrowing the financial from international financial organizations, we can get borrowing the money. But within the same time or within the particular time, we have to pay the borrowed money with the rate of interest. So even the time of repay, if you are not able to repay the money with the rate of interest, we have to be in the need of importing any of the countries. And our balance of payment system also will be very weak. The servicing of debt is a huge burden. So that is why the underdeveloped countries are forced to borrow more. So borrowing money is very easy one from any of the business financial organizations and any of the world financial organization. But the repaying borrowed money only is the matter, but all the underdeveloped countries also forced to borrowing more money without repaying the capacities. Next, technological backwardness. So due to the technological backwardness, the peoples are unable to use the energy available with them. So even though if have more resources, natural resources, we are unable to using the natural resources as a proper way. And even if we have more chance to adapting the technological, the advanced technological is there, we will not use. We will never get the interest to using the advanced technological to produce any of the commodities. As a result, they import huge petroleum products from foreign countries, increasing the trade deficit. So when we have finding out any of the automobile product with the solar energy, otherwise if we have to reduce the usage of petroleum product. So without doing any one of these two, we can't improve any of our export. So the deficit trade will be increased. Next, global politics. So under the global politics, the rich countries need to sell their weapons to promote their economy and generate employment. If any of the developed countries want to improve their export and generate the employment, it will be creating any of the reasons for the war. Hence, the wars between countries are stimulated in order to win the wars. The poor countries are forced to buy the weapons from weapon-rich countries. For example, if America wants to increasing their export and generating the employment, it will be creating the reasons between the other two countries. So the developed underdeveloped countries want to win to the wars. It will ready to import the weapons from the weapon-rich countries. So using the export earnings and creating the trade deficit, thus underdeveloped countries are trapped forever. So by the 8 reasons, the balance of payment disequilibrium may be arised. The cyclical fluctuations, the structural changes, development expenditure, consumerism, demonstrations effect, borrowing, technological backwardness, and global politics. Next, measures to correct the balance of payment disequilibrium. So all the nations or most of the nations are being in the balance of payment disequilibrium. If the nations are being in these disequilibrium situations, it is not good for their nations. It will be harmful, affect the economy of that nations. So all the nations have to take the measures or the effort to correct the balance of payment disequilibrium. So there are number of measures available for correcting the balance of payment disequilibrium. But even though they are divided into the two broad groups, the name is automatic corrections and deliberate measures. So automatic correction measures and deliberate measures. So the correcting the balance of disequilibrium measures broadly classified as two types: the automatic corrections and the deliberate measures. So automatic corrections means if the market forces of demand and supply are allowed to play freely, equilibrium will be automatically restored in course of time. So normally the price and the supply, that is called the market forces. So the price and supply, if we are allow the market mechanism, that is the demand and the supply, so it will be automatically correct the balance of payment. So it will bring the equilibrium automatically. So under the free exchange rate system, The automatic adjustment of the balance of payment can take place through changes in the variables like price, interest, income, and capital flows. So normally if the price or interest or income and the capital flows only will be determined the market forces, and if you are allow these four factors also will be bringing the equilibrium conditions of the balance of payment. So under the automatic corrections, the four measures are there. First one is price adjustment. So under the price adjustment, as a result of foreign exchange outflow from a deficit country to a surplus country, there will be a fall in the money supply in the deficit country and increase in the money supply in the surplus country. So if the low price low balance of payment disequilibrium countries are correcting their price, or if they are adjusting the price for their any of the commodities, so automatically the demand will come to the equilibrium point. So if the equilibrium point is come to the if the in this market come to the equilibrium point, so automatically so the import and the export will be corrected. So this will result in rise in the price in the surplus country, which will encourage imports and discourage the exports. So fall in prices in the deficit country will encourage export and discourage imports, leading to restorations of balance of payment equilibrium. The foreign exchange deficit countries have to adjust their price. Adjust their price means these nations has to reduce the price for their commodity. If the nations reduce the price for their commodities, what will happen? So all other nations want to import the same commodities from our nations. So the export will be encouraged, the import will be reduced. Otherwise, the export and import will come under the equal. Next, interest rate adjustment. This is also one of the price adjustment. So the contraction or expansion of money supply resulting from the balance of payment deficit or surplus leads to a rise or fall in the interest rate. A rise in interest rate in the deficit country will encourage investors to withdraw their funds from abroad and invest in their home country. The opposite happens in the surplus country. So normally the foreign direct investment will come into our nations on the basis of the interest rate. So the balance of payment deficit countries is increased the rate of interest. So all the foreign investors come to our nations and they will invest in our nations. So because of that, the investors also will get some of the benefit, and in the same time our industrializations also will be increased in our home countries. So automatically the export can be increased by correcting the adjustment of rate of interest. Next, income adjustment. A nation with payments surplus will experience rising income, which will increase imports, and thereafter equilibrium is restored in balance of payment. The income also have to be decreased in the deficit balance of payment nations. If the deficit balance of payment nations are going to reduce the income, their demand also will be reduced. So in our demand in domestic countries is reduced, they will export the same commodities to the another nations. So normally on the basis of the income only, the purchasing power and the consumption level also will be increased. But if the deficit balance of payment nations are reducing the income, So the peoples will never want to get more consumptions. So because of that, we can easily increase our commodities to the another nations as a exports. Okay students, I think it's enough. So if you have any doubt, please ask me. So under the automatic corrections, the four measures are there: price adjustment and the interest rate adjustment and the income adjustment and the capital flows. So you can take the same portions as your study portions. So just to take the causes for balance of payment disequilibrium as your study portions. If you have any doubt, please ask me. Thank you.